A Planet, Shmearth Bedtime Story. Sauropods, the original traffic jam. Let your eyelids grow heavy as you sink into the warmth of your bed. Feel the gentle weight of blankets settling around you like prehistoric sediment, layer by layer. The distant sound of your own breathing mingles with the imagined whisper of ancient winds through towering conifers. Your body relaxes muscle by muscle as we drift back to a time when patience wasn't a virtue. It was a geological necessity. And while you're sinking into the layers, go ahead and like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where on Earth you're watching from, so we can drift through history together, one slow layer at a time. Our story begins in the late Jurassic period, roughly 150 million years ago, when Earth had perfected the art of being spectacularly boring in the most beautiful way possible. The planet was warm and humid like a greenhouse that someone had forgotten to ventilate for several million years. Vast, shallow seas lapped lazily at the edges of supercontinents, making gentle lapping sounds that would have been perfect for meditation if anyone had been evolved enough to appreciate the concept of inner peace. In this world of endless summer, where ice caps were just a future geological experiment and seasons were more of a gentle suggestion than actual weather patterns, lived the most magnificently inefficient creatures ever to grace the planet with their presence, the sauropods. These were dinosaurs who had taken the concept of thinking big and run with it at approximately the speed of continental drift. Picture, if you can manage it without straining your increasingly drowsy mind, a creature so absurdly proportioned that it defied every reasonable expectation of how vertebrates should be constructed. The Brontosaurus, or Apatosaurus, if you're the sort of person who likes to correct people at dinner parties, was essentially a biological skyscraper that someone had forgotten to anchor to the ground. At nearly 75 feet long and weighing as much as 4 African elephants, it possessed a neck that stretched forward like nature's attempt at creating a living crane, complete with a head so small it looked like an afterthought. But here's where our tale becomes truly soporific. These gentle giants spent their entire existence doing absolutely nothing of consequence at a pace that would make glacial movement seem positively frantic. The morning sun filters through a canopy of araucaria trees, casting dappled shadows across a forest floor carpeted with soft cycad fronds. The air is thick with humidity and the gentle buzz of primitive insects who haven't yet learned to be properly annoying. In this peaceful setting, a herd of Brontosaurus has gathered to engage in their favorite activity, standing around and eating things very, very slowly. The lead female, let's call her Bertha, because she has the bearing of someone who has never hurried anywhere in her life, extends her impossibly long neck toward a cluster of conifer branches roughly 40 feet above the ground. Her head, which could comfortably fit inside a modern sedan with room to spare, closes around a branch with all the urgency of a government bureaucrat processing paperwork. She begins to chew, and this is where our story truly begins to embrace the art of doing absolutely nothing at all. Bertha chews and chews, and then, just when you might think she's finished chewing, she chews some more. Her jaw moves with the mechanical precision of a piece of industrial equipment that's been set to the extremely leisurely setting. Each chew takes approximately 30 seconds, not because the vegetation is particularly tough, but because her brain, roughly the size of a large grapefruit rattling around in a skull the size of a compact car, needs time to process the revolutionary concept that food goes in mouth, gets chewed, and then travels down an esophagus that's longer than most school buses. Behind Bertha, 17 other members of her herd engage in the same riveting activity, creating what paleontologists have never officially termed but should absolutely call the world's first traffic jam. Because you see, when you're dealing with creatures that are each roughly the length of a city bus and about as maneuverable as a freight train on a curved track, the simple act of eating becomes a logistical nightmare that would challenge modern urban planners. Now, you might wonder how these creatures managed to survive, given that their survival strategy appeared to consist entirely of stand still and hope nothing notices us. The answer lies in the beautiful simplicity of Jurassic period ecology, which operated on the principle that everything was so abundant that even the most spectacularly inefficient creatures could muddle through somehow. The forests of the late Jurassic were essentially all-you-can-eat buffets that stretched to every horizon. Conifers, cycads, and ferns grew in such profusion that they created their own weather systems. The air was so thick with moisture that it practically rained condensation, and the greenhouse effect kept temperatures warm and stable across most of the globe. It was, in short, a world designed for creatures whose entire life strategy was eat constantly and don't think about it too hard. But even in this paradise of plenty, the sauropods managed to create problems through the simple act of existing. Take, for instance, the phenomenon that modern traffic engineers would recognize immediately, the bottleneck. When Bertha decides, and decides is perhaps too strong a word for the slow-motion neural firing that passes for cognition in the sauropod brain, to move from her current feeding spot to a slightly different feeding spot roughly 10 feet away, she creates what can only be described as a prehistoric traffic situation. The movement begins with Bertha lifting her massive head from the branch she's been contemplating for the past hour. This action alone takes several minutes, as her neck muscles, designed more for structural support than rapid deployment, engage with all the enthusiasm of a rusty crane that hasn't been serviced in decades. Her head rises slowly, so slowly that you could take a nap during the ascent and wake up to find her still mid-lift. Once her head reaches its full height, approximately 4 stories above the forest floor, Bertha begins the complex process of deciding which direction to point it. This involves a series of micro-movements that would make a Swiss watch seem hastily assembled. Her neck sways gently from left to right, each movement taking long enough for the ambient forest sounds, the distant splash of waves against Jurassic shores, the soft rustling of pterosaur wings in the canopy above, the gentle drip of condensation from broad conifer needles, to create their own peaceful soundtrack. Meanwhile, the other members of the herd have noticed Bertha's movement, which in sauropod terms is roughly equivalent to someone shouting, "Fire!" in a crowded theater. The response is immediate, and by sauropod standards, frantic, which is to say several of them begin the process of also lifting their heads, creating a slow-motion chain reaction that ripples through the herd like a wave through thick honey. But here's where the traffic jam aspect becomes truly apparent. These creatures, magnificent as they are, suffer from the same problem that afflicts modern highway systems. They all want to go to the same place at the same time. In this case, the same place is a grove of particularly lush conifers about 50 yards away, and the same time is a relative term when you're dealing with creatures for whom quickly means sometime before the next geological epoch. The first problem is width. A single adult Brontosaurus occupies roughly the same amount of horizontal space as a modern city bus, assuming the bus had a tail that was also the length of a bus. When 18 of these creatures decide to move in the same direction, they require a corridor roughly the width of a modern 8-lane highway. The Jurassic forests, beautiful and abundant as they were, had not been designed with such specifications in mind. The second problem is length. Each sauropod stretches approximately 75 feet from nose to tail, which means that a herd-moving single file would create a procession roughly a quarter of a mile long. This would be manageable if they moved in a straight line, but sauropods, perhaps due to their walnut-sized brains or simply because they've never heard of the concept of efficiency, tend to wander like tourists in a museum who've lost track of their tour group. The third problem, and perhaps the most entertainingly frustrating, is speed. A motivated sauropod in a hurry can achieve speeds of up to 3 miles per hour, which is only slightly faster than the average walking pace of an arthritic tortoise. More typically, they cruise at a leisurely 1 to 2 miles per hour, which means that a journey of 50 yards, the distance from our current feeding area to the grove of tempting conifers, will take approximately 15 minutes if everything goes perfectly smoothly. But nothing ever goes perfectly smoothly when you're dealing with creatures whose spatial reasoning capabilities were apparently designed by someone who had never heard of geometry. As Bertha begins her glacial progress toward the conifer grove, she creates the first bottleneck. Her route takes her between two large cycad trees that are spaced approximately 25 feet apart. More than enough room for a creature that is, at her widest point, about 12 feet across. However, Bertha approaches this gap with the same careful consideration that a modern driver might use when parallel parking a stretch limousine in downtown Manhattan during rush hour. She stops. Her tiny brain, working at capacity, begins to process the complex spatial relationship between her body and the available space. This is roughly equivalent to asking a pocket calculator to solve quantum mechanics, but Bertha gamely gives it her best effort. Her head swivels slowly from side to side, taking measurements with the precision of a surveyor and the speed of geological erosion. Behind her, the rest of the herd has begun to bunch up like cars behind a slow-moving truck on a single-lane highway. The younger members of the group, blessed with the impatience of youth, begin to show signs of what could charitably be called frustration. This manifests as an increase in their swaying frequency from the standard 1 sway per minute to a positively frantic 1.5 sways per minute. Clarence, a middle-aged bull whose neck sports several interesting scars from a youthful encounter with an Allosaurus who had clearly overestimated his own abilities, stands directly behind Bertha and begins to experience what might be the sauropod equivalent of road rage. This consists primarily of extending and retracting his neck slightly more frequently than usual, creating a rhythmic movement that looks like the world's most lethargic head-banging. The problem compounds when Edith, an elderly female who has spent her entire 70-year lifespan perfecting the art of being in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, decides that she would prefer to feed on a cluster of ferns that are located at a 90-degree angle to the herd's intended direction of travel. She begins to turn, a process that, given her dimensions, requires roughly the same amount of space as a freight train switching tracks. Edith's turning radius is approximately 40 feet, which means that her tail, as she slowly pivots, sweeps through an area large enough to park several modern automobiles. This would be merely inconvenient if the area were empty, but of course it isn't. Mildred, a young adult female who has been following behind Edith with the mindless persistence of a GPS system that hasn't been updated since the Triassic period, suddenly finds herself faced with a wall of approaching sauropod tail. Now you might think that Mildred would simply stop, or perhaps back up, or employ any number of simple solutions to avoid collision, but this assumes a level of cognitive flexibility that evolution had simply not bothered to install in the sauropod operating system. Instead, Mildred does what sauropods do best. She stands perfectly still and hopes the problem will solve itself. Edith's tail continues its inexorable sweep, moving with all the unstoppable force of a glacier carving out a valley. The inevitable collision occurs at a speed that would make continental drift seem positively hasty. The impact, when it finally happens, produces a sound like someone dropping a leather sofa onto a pile of wet sandbags. Both creatures register the contact after a brief processing delay, then begin the complex sauropod procedure of figuring out what exactly has happened. Meanwhile, Bertha has finally completed her spatial analysis of the gap between the cycad trees and has determined that, yes, she can probably fit through it without becoming geologically embedded in the local flora. She begins to move forward, her massive feet settling into the soft forest floor with sounds like distant thunder muffled by several layers of cotton batting. Each step is a production worthy of its own geological epoch. Bertha lifts her front right foot, a process that takes approximately 15 seconds and involves the careful coordination of muscle groups that evolution had designed for stability rather than speed. The foot rises roughly 6 inches off the ground, enough to clear the typical obstacles of the Jurassic forest floor, and then moves forward a distance of approximately 3 feet, representing the maximum stride length that her body architecture can accommodate. This process is repeated with methodical precision, left front foot, right rear, left rear, creating a rhythm that is simultaneously hypnotic and mind-numbingly monotonous. It's the biological equivalent of a very slow, very heavy drum beat that never quite manages to reach the point where you could actually dance to it. As Bertha makes her way through the gap, a journey that takes approximately 7 minutes and covers a distance that a reasonably motivated human could traverse in about 10 seconds. The bottleneck behind her continues to evolve into something that would make modern traffic engineers weep with recognition. The situation becomes even more complex when a second group of sauropods, led by a mature female named Dorothy, who has spent her entire adult life following food sources with the single-minded determination of a GPS system, approaches from the opposite direction. Dorothy's herd has been working their way through a grove of particularly succulent cycads located roughly 100 yards to the north, and they have just noticed the same grove of conifers that has attracted Bertha's group. This creates what traffic engineers would immediately recognize as a merge situation, except that the creatures involved have no concept of merging, yielding, right-of-way, or indeed any of the social contracts that make modern transportation even marginally functional. Instead, they have only the simple, implacable drive to reach the food source, combined with the spatial reasoning skills of furniture. Dorothy's herd approaches the conifer grove from a slight angle, which means that their trajectory will intersect with Bertha's herd at approximately the same location where Bertha is still contemplating the gap between the cycad trees. This is the kind of situation that, in a more evolved world, might be resolved through communication, negotiation, or at the very least, some form of acknowledged turn-taking system. But sauropods communicate primarily through a combination of very low-frequency rumbles that travel through the ground and the occasional visual display involving neck positioning and slow, rhythmic swaying. These methods, while perfectly adequate for conveying simple messages like, "I am here," or "this is food," are not particularly well suited to complex traffic negotiation. As the two herds converge, the forest begins to take on the atmosphere of a very slow, very large-scale collision that's happening in extreme slow motion. The ground vibrations from 36 massive feet, moving at approximately one step every 30 seconds, create a kind of seismic rhythm that can be felt for miles around. Smaller dinosaurs, those fleet-footed creatures who zip through the forest at the breakneck pace of 15 or 20 miles per hour, pause in their activities to observe the developing situation with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. A small pack of Compsognathus, bipedal dinosaurs roughly the size of chickens but considerably more intelligent than the average sauropod, gathers on a nearby fallen log to watch the proceedings. They chatter among themselves in high-pitched squeaks that roughly translate to variations on, "Look at those idiots," and "How do creatures that large manage to get themselves into these situations?" Meanwhile, Bertha has successfully navigated the gap between the cycad trees, a triumph of engineering and determination that has taken approximately 12 minutes and represents the kind of personal achievement that would have merited a parade if anyone present had possessed sufficient cognitive capacity to appreciate the magnitude of the accomplishment. She now stands on the far side of the gap, her head swaying slowly as she contemplates the grove of conifers that beckons from roughly 40 yards ahead. But Bertha's success has created a new problem. She has now moved far enough ahead of the rest of her herd to break the loose formation that sauropods use for navigation and social cohesion. This formation, which operates on roughly the same principles as a very slow, very spread-out conga line, relies on each animal maintaining visual contact with the animal in front of it while avoiding the tail of that same animal. Clarence, who has finally made it through the gap himself after a journey that has consumed the better part of 20 minutes, emerges to find Bertha approximately 30 yards ahead and moving away from him at the typical sauropod cruising speed of roughly 2 miles per hour. This creates what modern psychologists would recognize as separation anxiety, though in sauropods it manifests primarily as increased swaying frequency and more frequent low-frequency vocalizations. These vocalizations, pitched so low that they're felt more than heard, ripple through the ground and create a kind of seismic communication network that alerts every sauropod within several miles that someone is experiencing mild distress. The response is immediate and, by sauropod standards, dramatic. Dozens of heads rise slowly above the forest canopy throughout the region, swaying gently as their owners attempt to locate the source of the distress call. This creates what can only be described as a prehistoric version of social media, where information travels at the speed of sound through solid rock, and every message is some variation of "something might be happening somewhere, but we're not entirely sure what." Back at ground level, Dorothy's herd has reached the outer edge of the conifer grove, just as Bertha's scattered followers are attempting to reassemble into something resembling their original formation. The two groups eye each other with the kind of cautious assessment that sauropods use to evaluate any situation that involves more than one creature in the same general area. Dorothy, as the matriarch of her herd, takes the lead in this diplomatic process. She extends her neck to its full height, approximately 50 feet above the forest floor, and begins what paleontologists have never officially termed but should absolutely call sauropod posturing. This involves a series of slow, ritualized movements that convey complex social information about dominance, herd status, and feeding rights through the medium of extremely gradual neck positioning. Bertha, recognizing a challenge to her own authority, responds with her own display. Her neck rises to match Dorothy's height, and she begins a slow, side-to-side swaying motion that indicates her readiness to defend her herd's claim to the conifer grove. The two matriarchs face each other across a distance of roughly 50 yards. Their necks swaying in a rhythm that suggests the world's slowest, most dignified dance-off. The rest of both herds positions themselves behind their respective leaders, creating two lines of massive dinosaurs facing each other like the world's most lethargic military formation. The younger members of both groups show signs of what might be called excitement, which manifests as slightly more frequent swaying and the occasional low-frequency rumble that vibrates through the forest floor like distant thunder. This standoff might have continued for hours or possibly days, given the sauropod approach to conflict resolution, but it is interrupted by the arrival of a third party. A solitary bull named Reginald, who has wandered into the area from the east, apparently drawn by the low-frequency communications that have been emanating from the grove for the past hour. Reginald is what paleontologists would delicately describe as past his prime. A bull who has survived to the impressive age of 85 years through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the kind of strategic cowardice that keeps one alive in a world full of creatures with large teeth and poor impulse control. More importantly for our current situation, Reginald is suffering from what modern veterinarians would immediately recognize as severe arthritis, which has reduced his already glacial movement speed to something that approaches geological timescales. As Reginald slowly makes his way toward the grove, moving at a pace that would make continental drift seem hasty, he creates a new wrinkle in the already complex social dynamics of the situation. His progress is marked by the rhythmic thud of his feet hitting the forest floor, each step creating small tremors that radiate outward through the root systems of ancient trees and alert every living creature in a half-mile radius that something very large and very determined is on the move. The arrival of a third party in what had been shaping up as a straightforward territorial dispute introduces what game theorists would recognize as a classic multiplayer scenario, except that the players involved have the strategic planning capabilities of decorative houseplants. The result is a kind of prehistoric Mexican standoff, where three groups of very large, very slow dinosaurs eye each other warily while trying to figure out what exactly they're supposed to do next. But their slow-motion diplomatic crisis is about to be interrupted by the arrival of two Allosaurus who have been tracking Reginald's progress for the better part of 2 days. These predators, each roughly the size of a modern pickup truck and equipped with the kind of dental equipment that would make a dentist weep with envy, have been following the elderly bull with the patient persistence of tax auditors, waiting for him to show signs of weakness or vulnerability. The arrival of two herds of sauropods at the same location as their target presents the Allosaurus pair with what amounts to a tactical windfall. the predators approach from the northeast, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that comes with being successful pack hunters. Unlike their intended prey, these creatures possess the cognitive flexibility and rapid response times that evolution typically provides to animals whose survival depends on their ability to catch and kill other animals. The first indication that the predators have arrived comes not from visual contact, but from the sudden cessation of background forest sounds. The various small dinosaurs who have been providing commentary and entertainment for the sauropod gathering suddenly fall silent, their primitive but effective threat detection systems alerting them to the presence of something large, fast, and equipped with the kind of dental work that suggests a primarily carnivorous lifestyle. This silence spreads through the forest like a slow wave as creature after creature recognizes the change in ambient sound patterns and responds with cautious alertness. The sauropods, with their limited peripheral vision and heads positioned at altitudes that make ground-level observation challenging, are slower to detect the presence of the predators. The first to respond is Dorothy, whose position at the northern edge of the grove gives her the best view of the approaching predators. Her response demonstrates the kind of rapid decision-making that comes with being a successful matriarch. She immediately abandons her territorial display and begins the complex process of alerting her herd to the presence of immediate danger. Sauropod danger signals involve a combination of high-amplitude, low-frequency vocalizations and dramatic postural changes designed to communicate the presence of threats to other herd members while simultaneously making the signaler appear as large and intimidating as possible. Dorothy's alarm call is picked up and amplified by the other members of her herd, creating a chorus of low-frequency sounds that travel through the forest floor and alert every sauropod community within a considerable radius. Bertha, still in the process of her territorial display, suddenly finds herself facing a tactical dilemma that would challenge even more sophisticated strategic thinkers. The presence of predators requires an immediate shift from intra-species conflict to interspecies defense, but the physics of sauropod movement make rapid strategic redeployment roughly as feasible as turning around an aircraft carrier in a swimming pool. Her solution demonstrates the kind of practical problem-solving that comes with decades of experience in predator-prey relationships. She abandons her territorial claims and begins the process of positioning herself between the approaching Allosaurus and the younger members of both herds. This repositioning requires approximately 4 minutes to complete, during which the predators cover roughly half the distance to their intended targets. Reginald finally alerted to the change in circumstances by the seismic vibrations created by 36 very large dinosaurs suddenly shifting from casual social interaction to emergency response mode, lifts his head from his feeding and begins his own threat assessment. His evaluation, conducted with all the methodical thoroughness that comes with 8 decades of surviving in a world full of creatures with sharp teeth and poor impulse control, reaches the conclusion that immediate strategic withdrawal might be advisable. But Reginald's arthritis, which has been a minor inconvenience during peaceful feeding activities, suddenly becomes a major tactical liability. His joints, inflamed and stiff from decades of supporting his massive weight, simply cannot generate the kind of rapid movement that the current situation seems to require. His solution demonstrates the kind of pragmatic resignation that comes with age and experience. Rather than attempting futile, evasive action, he positions himself in the center of the grove and prepares to make what military historians would recognize as a defensive stand. The sauropods begin to implement what can only be described as emergency social reorganization. The various family groups and herds that had been loosely distributed throughout the grove begin to consolidate into a more defensible formation, creating what paleontologists would never officially term, but should absolutely call, prehistoric wagon-train defense. This formation involves the largest and most experienced adults forming an outer defensive perimeter, while younger animals and those with limited defensive capabilities position themselves in the center of the formation. The reorganization process, executed at typical sauropod speeds, takes approximately 20 minutes to complete, during which the two Allosaurus maintain their tactical pressure while avoiding direct engagement. The defensive formation, once established, represents a significant escalation in the tactical sophistication of the sauropod response. Instead of individual animals defending themselves in isolation, the entire community has created a coordinated defensive system that maximizes their collective advantages while minimizing individual vulnerabilities. The Allosaurus pair, observing the development of coordinated sauropod defenses, demonstrates the kind of tactical adaptability that has made them successful predators. Rather than attempting to penetrate the defensive formation directly, they begin to implement what can only be described as psychological warfare tactics. This involves a pattern of coordinated movement and vocalization designed to maintain constant pressure on the defensive formation while avoiding direct engagement. The predators circle the sauropod formation at a distance of approximately 30 to 40 yards, close enough to maintain the threat of immediate attack, but far enough away to avoid defensive retaliation. The psychological warfare phase of the engagement continues for approximately 2 hours, during which both sides maintain their respective tactical positions while probing for weaknesses and opportunities. The sauropods maintain their defensive formation with the kind of stubborn persistence that has kept their species successful for millions of years, while the Allosaurus pair continues their pattern of coordinated intimidation. But the stalemate is eventually broken by an unexpected development: the arrival of additional sauropods attracted by the emergency vocalizations that have been emanating from the grove. The seismic communication network that Dorothy activated has succeeded in alerting sauropod communities throughout the region, and reinforcements have begun to arrive from multiple directions. The most significant reinforcement arrives nearly an hour after the crisis began. A solitary bull named Augustus, who represents what paleontologists would delicately describe as maximum sauropod defensive capability. At nearly 90 feet in length and weighing approximately 30 tons, Augustus is roughly twice the size of an average adult and possesses the kind of defensive capabilities that make even experienced predators reconsider their tactical options. Augustus's approach to the grove creates ground vibrations that can be felt for miles, announcing his arrival long before he becomes visible above the forest canopy. His reputation in the local sauropod community is legendary. He is known to have survived encounters with multiple predators, including at least one documented case where he successfully defended himself against a pack of 4 adult Allosaurus. The Allosaurus pair, observing the continued growth of the sauropod defensive force, faces what military strategists would recognize as a classic force ratio problem. Their original tactical assessment had been based on engaging a manageable number of defenders under favorable conditions, but the situation has evolved into something that exceeds their capabilities for successful predation. Their response demonstrates the kind of strategic flexibility that has kept them alive in a world full of very large herbivores who take a dim view of being eaten. Rather than attempting to maintain their tactical pressure against increasingly unfavorable odds, they begin the process of strategic withdrawal, conducting what can only be described as tactical reassessment of target selection priorities. The withdrawal is executed with the same professional competence that characterized their approach and engagement tactics. They maintain their coordinated movement patterns while gradually increasing their distance from the defensive formation, creating the impression of continued threat while actually reducing their tactical commitment to the engagement. As the sun begins to set over the late Jurassic landscape, casting long shadows through the conifer canopy and creating the kind of golden light that makes everything look like a nature documentary, the sauropods begin the slow process of returning to their normal feeding routines. The defensive formation gradually dissolves as individual animals and family groups resume their interrupted meals, though with significantly heightened awareness of their surroundings. The entire engagement from initial predator contact to final withdrawal has consumed approximately 6 hours and represents what paleontologists would never officially term but should absolutely call the most significant traffic management and crisis response exercise in sauropod recorded history. The grove, which had begun the day as a simple feeding location, has been transformed into a testament to the defensive capabilities and social coordination that have kept sauropod communities functional for millions of years. Bertha finally gains access to the branch she had been contemplating when the crisis began, though the feeding process now includes regular pauses to scan the surrounding forest for signs of potential threats. Reginald, exhausted by several hours of sustained defensive alertness, settles into a feeding pattern that balances his need for nutrition with his requirement for rest and recovery. As darkness settles over the grove, the various sounds of Jurassic Night life begin to emerge from the forest. The distant calls of nocturnal pterosaurs echo through the canopy, while the soft splash of waves against far-off shores provides a rhythmic backdrop to the peaceful sounds of large herbivores settling in for the night. The day's events, dramatic as they were by sauropod standards, represent just another chapter in the ongoing story of life in the late Jurassic period. Tomorrow will bring new feeding opportunities, new social challenges, and probably new traffic management problems as these magnificent creatures continue their slow-motion journey through geological time. The grove settles into the kind of peaceful quiet that comes after successful crisis resolution, with only the gentle sounds of nocturnal feeding and the occasional low-frequency communication between family groups disturbing the forest silence. The sauropods, having successfully defended their feeding territory and maintained their social structures in the face of significant challenges, demonstrate once again that sometimes the best strategy for dealing with life's complications is simply to be very, very large, move very, very slowly, and hope that everything works out for the best in the end. The gentle rhythm of your breathing mingles with the distant sounds of those ancient forests where time moved at the pace of growing stone and the most urgent crisis could unfold over the course of an entire afternoon. Let your eyelids grow heavy like the shadows cast by those impossibly long necks, and drift into sleep with the knowledge that somewhere in the deep past, creatures the size of buildings spent their days creating traffic jams that would make modern rush hour seem positively frantic by comparison. Rest well, knowing that patience truly is a virtue, especially when you're too large to hurry and too slow to worry about much of anything except finding the next perfect branch to contemplate for several geological epochs. Sweet dreams of prehistoric gridlock and the magnificent inefficiency of evolution's most gloriously oversized experiments in simply existing very slowly in a world that had all the time in the ages to let them figure it out. The gentle rhythm of your breathing mingles with the distant sounds of those ancient forests where time moved at the pace of growing stone, and the most urgent crisis could unfold over the course of an entire afternoon. And if this long drift through the past helped carry you off, leave a like and subscribe so the story can keep winding on, one slow age at a time.